476 AD, the doors of the imperial palace open for the last time. A child in a purple tunic, barely 15 years old, watches as a barbarian general advances toward him with firm steps. That child is named Romulus Augustulus, and in a matter of minutes he will cease to be emperor. There will be no epic battles, no heroic defenses. Simply, the last representative of a Millennium-Old empire will be stripped of his crown without anyone raising a sword in his defense. But wait, how did we get here? How is it possible that the most powerful civilization humanity has ever known, the one that dominated 3 continents for centuries, crumbled like a sandcastle? The answer is not on that day in 476. It is much earlier, in the invisible cracks that formed over generations, in the decisions that seemed insignificant but would end up destroying everything Rome had built. And if you stay until the end of this video, you will understand that the fall of Rome was not an accident, it was a warning. But before continuing, if you want more content like this, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any documentary. Let's go back to the moment when Rome still seemed invincible. Imagine for a moment that you are a Roman citizen of the 2nd century AD. You walk through the streets of the capital of the world, surrounded by monuments that seem eternal. The Colosseum stands majestic. The baths overflow with people. The Forum boils with commercial activity, from Britannia to Egypt, from Hispania to Syria. All known lands pay tribute to your emperor. Your legions are invincible. Your language is the language of power. Your civilization defines what it means to be human. What could go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything. The truth is that Rome was already sick long before the barbarians knocked on its doors. The first symptoms appeared during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of 50 years between 235 and 284, which almost completely destroyed the empire. During those 5 decades, more than 50 men claimed the title of emperor. Some lasted years, others barely months. Most ended up eliminated by their own soldiers, victims of an endless cycle of betrayals and civil wars. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand how Rome fell, we first need to understand what made it great. And the answer is not what you and I think. It was not just its military might, although its legions were formidable. It was not solely its engineering genius. Although they built aqueducts and roads that still endure, the true secret of Rome was something much more subtle: its capacity to integrate. Rome did not just conquer peoples, it Romanized them. A Gaul, a Hispanic, a Syrian could become Roman citizens, participate in politics, serve in the legions, even reach the imperial throne. That was Rome's genius, turning its enemies into Romans. However, that same strength would become its greatest weakness, because while Rome integrated peoples, it was also diluting its own identity. The legions that were previously composed of loyal Italian citizens to the Republic were now filled with Germans, Thracians, Syrians, men who fought for pay, not for Rome. And there, in that invisible change, the seed of destruction was sown. Now, when did the decline really begin? Some historians point to the year 180 when Marcus Aurelius died, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors. His son, Commodus, was the complete opposite. A megalomaniac who believed himself Hercules reincarnated and preferred to fight as a gladiator rather than govern. His disastrous reign opened the floodgates of chaos. After his elimination in 192, the empire plunged into a civil war that demonstrated a terrifying truth. The throne of Rome was bought with swords, not with legitimacy. But the true crisis, this one that almost tore the empire apart, came in the 3rd century. Imagine the scene. The empire's borders stretched for thousands of kilometers from Hadrian's Wall in Britannia to the desert of Mesopotamia. Defending those borders requires massive armies, and those armies cost fortunes. Meanwhile, the Roman economy falters. Gold and silver mines are depleted. The currency is devalued. The emperors, desperate to pay their troops, order coins to be minted with less and less precious metal, a coin that in the 1st century contained 95% silver. In the 3rd century barely has 5%. The result? Uncontrolled inflation. Prices skyrocket. Trade stalls. Cities become impoverished And while Rome bleeds economically, its enemies grow in power. To the north, the Germanic tribes, which were previously barely a nuisance, now organize into dangerous confederations. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, names that would soon terrorize the Roman world. To the east, the Sassanid Empire resurges strongly, claiming territories that Rome considered its own. In the year 260, something unthinkable happens. Emperor Valerian is captured by the Persians. It is the first time in history that a Roman emperor falls prisoner to a foreign enemy. The humiliation is total. According to chronicles, the Persian king Shapur I used Valerian as a human step to mount his horse. And when the emperor finally died, his skin was flayed and displayed in a Persian temple as a trophy. Do you realize what this means? The emperor, the man the Romans considered almost a living god, reduced to an object of mockery. Rome's invincibility had been broken forever. Then came Diocletian, a humble Dalmatian soldier who rose to become emperor in 284. Diocletian understood something fundamental. The empire was too large to be governed by one man alone. His solution was radical: divide the empire into two halves, east and west, each with its own emperor and its own Caesar. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, worked for a time. Diocletian managed to stabilize the economy, reform the army, and restore order. But in doing so, he also institutionalized the division. Rome was no longer one. It was two separate entities that over time would take different paths. And here is where history becomes fascinating. Because while the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the Eastern Roman Empire flourished. Constantinople, the new capital founded by Constantine in 330, became the richest city in the world. While Rome declined, Constantinople shone. And that division was not only political or economic, it was cultural, linguistic, religious. The West spoke Latin, the East Greek. The West followed ancient Roman traditions. The East embraced Christianity with mystical fervor. Two worlds that shared a name, but had less and less in common. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the perfect time to do so. This type of in-depth historical analysis requires research and dedication. And your support makes it possible for us to continue creating quality content. Now, let's talk about the barbarians, because this is where you and I need to debunk a myth. When we think of the fall of Rome, we imagine wild hordes razing cities, burning libraries, destroying civilization. But the reality was much more complex and, in a way, more tragic. The barbarians did not destroy Rome. Rome invited them in. Let me explain. By the 5th century, the Roman legions were mostly composed of Germanic soldiers. These men were not prisoners or slaves. They were federated allies, foederati in Latin, who served the empire in exchange for land and pay. Many of Rome's most important generals in its last centuries were of barbarian origin. Stilicho, the man who practically governed the Western Empire for years, was half Vandal. Ricimer, the emperor-maker of the 5th century, was of Suevian origin. Odoacer, the man who finally deposed the last emperor, was a Germanic mercenary who had served in the Roman army his entire life. See the irony? Rome did not fall to an external invasion. It collapsed from within, consumed by its own dependence on the peoples it had supposedly conquered. The decisive blow came with the Huns. These nomads from the steppes, led by the fearsome Attila, did not want to integrate into Rome. They wanted to sack it. Their arrival in the 5th century unleashed a devastating domino effect. The Goths, terrified by the Huns, asked for refuge within the Roman borders. Emperor Valens accepted, thinking he could control them. It was a catastrophic mistake. In the year 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the rebel Goths annihilated the Roman army. The emperor himself died on the battlefield, and his body was never found. It was Rome's worst military defeat in centuries and proved that the legions were no longer invincible. After Adrianople, everything accelerated. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, wandered the empire for years seeking land and recognition. Rome tried to appease them with gold, with promises. Nothing worked. In the year 410, Alaric lost patience. His troops entered Rome and sacked it for 3 days. It was the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City fell to a foreign enemy. The psychological shock was immense, St. Jerome, living in the Holy Land, wrote, "My voice breaks. The city that conquered the world has been conquered." But even after Alaric was sacked, Rome survived, battered, humiliated, but still alive. The empire continued for 60 years more like a boxer who refuses to fall despite the blows. There were moments of hope. General Aetius defeated Attila at the Catalonian plains in 451, saving the West from total annihilation. But that victory came at a price. Aetius relied on barbarian allies to achieve it. Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, they all fought against the Huns, not for Rome, but for their own interests. And then came the end, not with glory, but with a sigh. In the year 476, General Odoacer decided he no longer needed to maintain the farce. He deposed the young Romulus Augustulus, sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, and proclaimed himself King of Italy. Not emperor, king. Because Odoacer understood that the title of Roman emperor no longer meant anything. The Western Roman Empire had ended, not with an epic battle, but with an administrative act. Now you and I might think that was it, that Rome simply disappeared. But here is the part no one tells you. Rome never fully fell. What fell was its Western political structure. But the Eastern Roman Empire, what we know as the Byzantine Empire, continued for almost 1,000 years more. Constantinople considered itself the true Rome. Its emperors called themselves Romans. Its law was based on Roman law. Its administrative language was Latin until it was gradually replaced by Greek. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantines still considered themselves Romans. But let's return to the West. What happened after 476? The barbarian kingdoms that emerged on the ruins of the empire tried to keep Roman traditions alive. Theodoric the Great, Ostrogothic king of Italy, strove to preserve the laws, institutions, even Roman buildings. Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Catholic Christianity to gain legitimacy before the Roman population of the Gauls. The Visigoths of Hispania adopted Latin and Roman customs. In a sense, the barbarians wanted to be Romans more than to destroy Rome. Why? Because Rome represented civilization, order, law, culture. The Germans could conquer territories, but they knew their legitimacy depended on connecting with that Roman heritage. That is why Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned Roman emperor in the year 800. That is why the Holy Roman Empire claimed to be the legitimate successor of Rome for centuries. That is why even the Russian czars took their title of Caesar, the Roman word for emperor. If you have made it this far, it means you are really interested in history. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who also appreciates this type of content. So, why did Rome really fall? The question has obsessed historians for centuries. The historian Edward Gibbon, in his monumental 17th century work, blamed Christianity. He argued that the Christian religion weakened Rome's martial spirit, turning warriors into monks, proud citizens into humble believers. Others have pointed to economic factors, uncontrolled inflation, trade collapse, mine depletion. Some speak of environmental factors, devastating plagues, climate changes that ruined crops, diseases that decimated the population. But the truth, and this is what you and I must understand, is that Rome fell for all those reasons and for none. It was a gradual, cumulative process where each problem fed the next. The economy collapsed, so the state could not pay its soldiers. Without pay, the soldiers rebelled. Rebellions caused civil wars. Civil wars weakened the borders. Weak borders allowed invasions. Invasions destroyed the economy, and the cycle began again. In addition, there was a factor that is rarely mentioned, but was crucial: the loss of North Africa. When the Vandals conquered Carthage in 439, they cut off the grain supply that fed Rome. North Africa was the empire's breadbasket. Without it, Italy starved. And a starving empire is a dying empire. Let me give you a fact that puts everything in perspective. In the year 100 AD, the city of Rome had approximately 1 million inhabitants. It was the largest metropolis in the ancient world. By the year 500, its population had fallen to fewer than 20,000 people. The great avenues were empty, the aqueducts broken, the public baths abandoned. The Colosseum, where crowds of 50,000 once roared, now served as a fortress for criminal gangs. Rome, the eternal city, had become a ghost town. However, and here is the paradox, Roman culture survived. The Catholic Church, which had adopted the empire's administrative structure, became the guardian of Roman civilization. Monasteries preserved classical texts. Bishops assumed governmental functions previously performed by magistrates. The Pope became in many ways the new emperor of Rome, not with armies, but with spiritual authority. And Latin, the language of Rome, did not die. It evolved. In the different regions of the former empire, Vulgar Latin gradually transformed into the Romance languages: Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. Each of these languages a direct descendant of the Latin spoken by the legionaries, merchants, slaves of the empire. When you and I speak Spanish, we are speaking the grandson of Roman Latin. Roman law also survived. The Code of Justinian, compiled in the 6th century by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, preserved Roman laws and became the basis of legal systems throughout Western Europe. Even today, concepts like habeas corpus, presumption of innocence, property rights, all come from Roman law. Roman architecture influenced every subsequent civilization. The arches, vaults, domes that Rome perfected were adopted by Byzantines. Islamic, Renaissance. The Pantheon of Rome, built in the 2nd century, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. 2,000 years later, it still amazes us. And here we come to an uncomfortable question. Did Rome really fall, or did it simply transform? Because when we look at medieval Europe, what we see is not the absence of Rome, but its metamorphosis. The Germanic kingdoms did not reject being Roman. They aspired to be. Feudalism adopted concepts from Roman law. Medieval Christianity was saturated with Roman philosophy. The very idea of Europe as a cultural entity was born from Romanization. Even when the Eastern Roman Empire finally collapsed in 1453, its legacy did not die. Byzantine scholars fleeing the Turks brought Greek and Roman manuscripts to Italy, triggering the Renaissance. The rediscovery of classical texts transformed Europe, gave rise to humanism, modern science, the Enlightenment, before ending. I want you to subscribe if you haven't already. Documentaries like this require hours of research and scripting, and every subscriber motivates us to keep creating content of this quality. So, what is the lesson of Rome's fall? What can you and I learn from the greatest civilization of the ancient world that crumbled under its own weight? First, that no empire is eternal. Rome seemed invincible, but it was not. Second, that greatness carries responsibilities. Rome conquered the world, but then could not defend it. Third, that internal corruption is more dangerous than any external enemy. It was not the barbarians who destroyed Rome. It was the civil wars, inflation, institutional decay. But there is a deeper lesson, one that is rarely mentioned. Rome fell because it stopped believing in itself. By the 5th century, few true Romans remained. The legions were full of barbarians. The emperors were puppets of Germanic generals. The aristocracy had retreated to their fortified villas, abandoning the cities. No one was willing to die for Rome because Rome had ceased to mean anything. It had become an empty idea, a soulless shell. And perhaps that is the true tragedy. Not that Rome was conquered, but that it surrendered. Not that its enemies were too strong, but that Rome became too weak. Because in the end, what destroyed the most powerful empire in history was not the sword of a barbarian. It was the apathy of its own citizens. But remember this, although the Roman Empire fell, Roman civilization never died. Every time you read a book, every time you walk through a planned city, every time you appeal to the law, every time you use words derived from Latin, you are connecting with Rome. Its legacy is so interwoven in our culture that it is impossible to separate it. In that sense, Rome never fell. It simply changed form. 476 AD, a child emperor is deposed without violence. The palace doors close and 1,000 years of history come to an end. But while those doors were closing, others were opening. The Middle Ages began. Christianity consolidated. The Germanic peoples formed new nations, and on the ruins of Rome slowly, painfully, a new civilization would emerge. One that would honor the past while building the future. That is the true story of how Rome fell. Not an end, but a transition. Not a death, but a metamorphosis. And if it teaches us anything, it is that even the greatest empires eventually fall. But their ideas, their values, their culture can endure for millennia. Rome fell 1,500 years ago, but you and I still live in a world shaped by its influence. And that perhaps is the purest form of immortality. If this video has made you reflect, share it, because stories like this remind us where we come from and perhaps where we are going. Oh,